Minister for the Cabinet Office, Mr. John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, I should start by saying I hold the honourable gentleman in equally high regard. He was very kind in his remarks about me just now, and explained to him that he will appreciate from the title of the debate that he has chosen that this is a topic which falls neatly between three different departments. You could argue that parts of it need to be responded to by the Department for Communities and Local Government, parts of it perhaps by the Policing Minister, and parts of it, those to do with electoral fraud, by myself from the Cabinet Office. So I am here this evening wearing three hats with three sets of different briefings, and I will endeavour to cover the entire waterfront, but I'm sure that we can follow up with any points which the honourable gentleman may have as follow-up questions as we go. But I will endeavour at least to cover all the issues that he has raised. And can I start, Mr. Speaker, by congratulating him on raising this issue. It isn't just something which is important to his constituency and the borough in which he operates, although it is undoubtedly crucially important there, but it is something which I think has resonance in many parts of the country. Thankfully, electoral fraud is not something which is terribly common in Britain. It's not something which we encounter very often. There's a steady trickle of allegations and occasionally of successful prosecutions and problems with our elections, but it is only a trickle. But of course, as the old saying goes, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. It would be entirely wrong for us to become complacent about this. The only way in which we can maintain an otherwise, I think, enviable set of trust and widespread trust in this country's elections is if we take problems such as those as they occurred in Tower Hamlets extremely seriously when they do crop up, and make sure that there is no repetition, and that anybody thinking of misbehaving in the same way finds it incredibly difficult and is dissuaded from going down that route. Good.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. Can I just put on the record my personal admiration for, frankly, the heroism of those people who took this matter to the Electoral Court? And would he not agree that it would be a betrayal of their courage if the police, for reasons of political correctness, were not to follow through on what appears to be, in the case laid out by the honourable gentleman who has spoken, open and shut matter of criminality?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I was in fact just about my honourable friend anticipated my next remarks, because I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to the four petitioners, and we just heard how they were pretty heroic in the way they pursued this. They were not dissuaded. There were plenty of opportunities where lesser people might have backed away, and they did not take those opportunities. They pursued it through thick and thin, and on occasions it was pretty thick and pretty thin what they had to put up with. And yet they continued throughout. And I think we all owe them a debt of thanks, particularly, obviously, those locally in Tower Hamlets. But not just to those four petitioners. There are other people who I think have picked up the challenge as well. My honourable friend, or right honourable friend, the former Secretary of State, MP for Brentwood and Ongar, who put the commissioners into Tower Hamlets in the first place, the commissioners themselves, of course, and presiding judge QC, Richard Morey, and a number of other officials have been brought in as well, including people like Barry Quirk, and we've already heard the assiduous and determined campaign mounted by local councillors such as Peter Golds as well. So many people have rallied round the cause of democracy in Tower Hamlets, and I think that is all to the good. And now, I hope the honourable gentleman will appreciate I can't necessarily comment on the details of specific investigations that are still ongoing. He is a very experienced parliamentarian and also an experienced former minister as well, so he will understand the constraints on what I can and can't say. But I think he is doing entirely the right thing. He mentioned in his remarks that he is about to have, I think, discussions and meetings with Commissioner Hogan Howe and perhaps others as well. And I hope that they will be able to provide him with further reassurances about what is going on with those current investigations. I understand that there are still investigations, for example, into grants fraud in parallel with the investigations into electoral fraud. Those are still ongoing too. They aren't something which perhaps can be made public, but he may be able to get more reassurance. And I hope he will also, I'm sure he will also, pursue assiduously and very determinedly the point made by my honourable friend that there were some extremely trenchant criticisms made by Richard Morey in his judgment. And while many people may have been expecting that therefore it would be straightforward to come up with a prosecution, clearly there are different standards of proof. As he mentioned, there are also different levels of admissibility. The police and the Crown Prosecution Service need to make a judgment, but he will want to pursue the individual cases and the individual allegations to find out what can and cannot be pursued. And I think that local people in Tower Hamlets and more broadly in the electoral community more widely will want to know, well, how can we be sure that these sorts of cases will be pursued in the strongest possible terms whenever the evidence allows? So I would encourage him in those meetings and pursuing those inquiries that he plans to have. I also understand he asked where do the plaintiffs stand in respect of recovering costs. He then gave, I think, at least a partial answer to his own question by talking about some of the discussions and investigations that are still ongoing to the ownership of various assets associated with Mayor Rahman or perhaps with members of his family. There have been a number of press stories and a number of reports of court judgments about what has and has not been found to be either the property of former Mayor Rahman or indeed his family. I understand that process is still ongoing, and again I'm afraid I can't comment much beyond that, but that is not a story which is finished, not a set of conclusions which have been finally reached. And I think that the mills of both God and in this case the justice system are grinding forward slowly, but one hopes exceeding small as well. He also asked about how we might take forward the broader question of how electoral fraud can be made less easy. It's not easy in the first place, but how it can be made even more difficult to perpetrate, and to make sure that the consequences of electoral fraud are clear, swift and unappealing to people considering undertaking it. And there I go back to mentioning my right honourable friend, the member for Brentwood and Ongar, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. He is at this moment working on a report for the government, which will be landing, I suspect, on my desk with a satisfactory, large and weighty thud at some point in the next few weeks or maybe a month or two, on electoral fraud, and with a series of recommendations into how we can tighten rules still further. I obviously wouldn't want to prejudge the results of what he might recommend, but the honourable gentleman will appreciate that, having been Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, and I think before he came into this House, Mr. Speaker, a leader of a local council as well, my right honourable friend will have observed local democracy up close. He will have seen its strengths and its weaknesses. He will have seen the local democratic process in huge detail, as well as the parliamentary democratic process. And I think that I can't think of anybody who is better placed to come up with some trenchant and I hope closely reasoned recommendations. So I look forward to receiving those, and I think that all of us will want to read them and consider them in quite some depth. Beyond that, of course, we will have to wait and see what he recommends, but I can confirm that both he and I have spent some time with Richard Morey, for example, discussing what he saw both at Tower Hamlets, but also in his previous judgment, since he has something of a track record of specialising in this area and of examining a series of problems, thankfully not terribly frequent, but where they have come up, he is probably the single person with the best judicial experience in the country, and so we've spoken to him, and we've also spoken in depth to people like Peter Golds, who he mentioned as well. So there's been plenty of care taken to gather whatever information is available out there, and therefore I'm sure we all wait to see the results of my right honourable friend's report as and when it arrives. The honourable gentleman's final question was where the local righting of the ship has got to in Tower Hamlets. And I have made some inquiries of Department for Communities and Local Government just to see where we've got to on that. And I think the answer is broadly that there has been huge progress, but there is still further to go. I understand that the Council has made some progress against some key areas in its best value action plan: procurement, property disposals, elections management. And there's been particular progress, I can tell the honourable gentleman, since the arrival of Mayor Biggs last June and the new CEO Will Tuckley in October. However, there are still concerns over delays in other intervention areas, in particular grants, communication and organisational cultural changes. Some of these things obviously take longer to bed in. And progress in these areas, Mr. Speaker, will need continued and close monitoring by the Commissioners to make sure that progress so far is not eroded and does not start to flag. So I think that the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government will continue to monitor very closely and will not consider any variation to the current directions until there is sufficient evidence that the change has been deeply embedded and that the key outcomes have been delivered. I'm sure that the honourable gentleman would want that to be the criteria. Clearly, given the seriousness of the problems that were encountered, and he very ably and very lucidly summarised the worst of them, but there were many others which he wouldn't have had time to go into. Given the seriousness and the acuteness of those problems in Tower Hamlets, I'm sure that he will applaud every move to make sure that there is no prospect of a reoccurrence and that therefore those standards have been fully attained before we are able then to get back to, I'm sure, widely wished for normality in the electoral arrangements and the registration arrangements in Tower Hamlets. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I hope that answers the honourable gentleman's questions. Where I haven't been able to answer them because they are subject to ongoing investigations, he is quite rightly, and I applaud him for it, going to speak to the police and the police commissioner himself and others. I hope he will get the answers there which he cannot get here. And if he pieces those various parts of the jigsaw together, I hope that he will therefore have an optimistic picture, albeit one which cannot yet be said to have solved the problem, but at least there is progress and a problem that is being solved, even if we've not quite reached our final destination.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as I vote opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.